course on Christian philosophy. As a Christian and a philosopher, I sometimes encounter suspicion from two fronts: Christians who are skeptical of philosophy, and philosophers who are skeptical of Christianity. My goal in this first lesson is to begin to address the first of these concerns. Why should a Christian care about philosophy? Isn't worldly wisdom the kind of thing that Christians are warned to avoid? Let me begin by granting that this concern is not always unfounded. At this point, I suspect most Christians know at least one person who has walked away from the faith after their first encounter with philosophy. The story usually goes something like this. A Christian, often young, often raised in the church, discovers the work of a popular atheist with some philosophical training, Harris, Dennett, Hitchens, or Dawkins. She reads that her belief in God is foolish and irrational, the intellectual equivalent of believing in a flying spaghetti monster. The language varies, but the message is clear. Belief in God is like a dangerous mental illness, wholly irrational, utterly harmful to all involved. Before long, she's convinced. Christianity, like all religious belief, is the stuff of fools. Why, after a lifetime in the church, do so many Christians find these writings persuasive? Here's at least a partial answer. Curious Christians are discovering philosophical questions without the help and guidance of the Christian philosophical community. Never having encountered Christian philosophy, they come to associate the hallmarks of philosophical reasoning, careful thinking, rational evaluation, with atheism. They may bring their questions and concerns to their parents, friends, or pastors, but unless those Christians are adept at these skills, they may be unable to help in the ways required. It's one thing to dislike or disagree with atheistic accusations. It is another thing entirely to be able to engage with and respond to their arguments. As a result, these intellectually curious Christians conclude that atheism is the thoughtful and intelligent choice, and Christianity is the stuff of blind faith. This conclusion is unfortunate, incorrect, and historically unfounded. Christianity and the discipline of philosophy have a long, rich, shared history. The Apostle Paul makes frequent references to the Greek philosophers of his time. Many of the early church fathers were themselves philosophers. Christianity and philosophy have long been partners, not enemies. The trouble is, contemporary churchgoers just don't know about this shared history. But wait, I still haven't even told you what philosophy is. In Lesson 2, we will delve deeper into this question, but for now, here's a good starting point. The word philosophy means love of wisdom. The study of philosophy is, or ought to be, the pursuit of wisdom. Very simply stated, philosophy asks you to think more carefully about what you believe. This is the core of philosophy. Why is that good for the church? Well, at the most basic level, it's good for the church to be equipped with believers who know what they believe. It is good for believers to develop the skills of thinking clearly, reading clearly, and working through the reasons they have for their beliefs that they hold. In my own life, the study of philosophy absolutely transformed my ability to read Scripture with a careful eye. In addition, there's a wealth of Christian philosophical writings. Many of the doctrines central to Christianity have as their root the philosophical writings of Augustine, Aquinas, or other early philosophers. At the same time, the last 50 years have seen a tremendous resurgence of Christian philosophy. You don't need to turn to the medieval thinkers to find thoughtful Christians giving careful reflections on core Christian doctrines. You can, but you don't need to. Such reflections abound today. Still, I won't deny that a great deal of recent philosophical writing is explicitly designed to undermine the Christian faith. Dawkins is especially clear about his aim, to make atheists out of theists. The last 20 years have given rise to an especially pernicious sort of atheistic philosophy, the so-called new atheists referenced above. The newness of the new atheist movement is largely a matter of style. Where the old atheistic philosophers wrote mostly for other philosophers, the new ones write and speak primarily to a popular audience. Perhaps unsurprisingly, their approach has been quite successful at the popular level, even as in academic circles they're largely dismissed as amateurs. New atheism sets out to convert philosophically curious religious believers into atheists, and it manages to do so far more often than it should. In response, the church must rise to the challenge, encouraging and equipping philosophically capable, prepared, intellectually resilient believers. But I'm a philosopher. Of course I'm going to suggest more philosophy as the solution to this problem. Maybe you think the more reasonable solution is to pull the weed out at its root and reject philosophy. But this would be a mistake. In fact, I believe that this anti-philosophical response is a dangerous mistake for at least 3 reasons. First, it comes from a place of fear. Second, it is almost never effective. And third, we can do better. What message do we send when we tell someone that the answer to his or her doubts is to stop asking questions? I will tell you what message that sends. It says, we don't have the answers. If you must insist on finding them, you will have to look elsewhere. So first, to see that the anti-philosophical response comes from a place of fear, not faith, consider, why should asking questions lead a believer away from God? The idea that it must rests upon the presumption that no Christian answers to these questions are available. This is not faith in the truth of Christianity. It is fear that Christianity won't hold up to intellectual scrutiny. Second, this approach almost never works. Telling a person to ignore her concerns does very little to alleviate those concerns. Suppose that you had reason to worry that your brother was developing a dangerous addiction, or your friend was in an abusive relationship, or that your recurring headaches were a sign of something more serious than allergies. Now suppose that instead of addressing these worries, your brother, friend, or doctor told you not to worry about it. Would you feel better? The Christian who has begun to worry about the hard questions has already encountered some troubling bit of evidence. Telling her to stop thinking about that evidence is unwise and ineffective. What kind of evidence? Well, maybe she's worried about the suffering in this world, or the spiritual fate of those born into cultures with little knowledge of Christianity. In short, perhaps she's begun to grapple with a philosophical question. These questions bring with them some worrying bits of evidence. There is indeed a great deal of suffering and evil in this world. There are quite a lot of people living without access to or knowledge of the gospel. The Christian who has been moved by this evidence is not going to just forget about it. Just last week, I read about the deconstruction and deconversion of another incredible musician and former worship leader, Audrey Assad. Her story is sad for a number of reasons, but what struck me the most was a moment that she described at the start of her doubts. She was interested in reading the works of Richard Rohr, a Franciscan priest and author. Rohr's work pushes the boundaries of orthodoxy. Assad recalls expressing an interest in his work and being promptly told by her priest that she was not allowed to read them. Although she initially obeyed, this moment led to others until she, I would say almost inevitably, came to wonder what her priest was so afraid of. She ultimately left the church, for now at least, but I find myself wondering, what if that priest had read Rohr's work with her? What if they had talked through his ideas together? What if they had followed up with other similar works by a range of Christian authors? What could that have led to? The anti-philosophical response is dangerous, and it is entirely unnecessary. We can do better. We can pursue wisdom together. We can ask the hard questions together. We can make use of the resources provided by those who have gone before us, Christian philosophers, both historical and contemporary. We can do better, but we often don't. In telling the story of his own journey away from and back to Christianity, author J.D. Vance describes his early struggles as follows. He wrote, "A lot of it had to do with a feeling of irrelevance. Increasingly, the religious leaders I turned to tended to argue that if you prayed hard enough and believed hard enough, God would reward your faith with earthly riches. But I knew many people who believed and prayed a lot without any riches to show for it." In my own life, a woman I loved very much fell in with some pastors who believed in the name it and claim it brand of healing. When her cancer persisted, despite their prayers, they concluded that she lacked faith. They refused to continue to pray with her. This woman preached the gospel in the hospitals where she was treated, and these pastors didn't even attend her funeral. Here's the point, and we mustn't forget it. When we refuse to take seriously the challenges of this world, when we choose instead to look away from them, we will end up with dangerously bad theology. Theology that can't handle reality is no good to anyone. Indeed, there's a growing trend in our culture to treat religious belief as a kind of self-help manual. On this view, all that really matters is the role that your faith plays in your life. If it makes you happy, that's great. If it doesn't, ditch it. As long as we all feel good about the role of religion in our lives, we don't need to worry about disagreements or difficult questions. This general attitude captures what we might call feel-good faith. Although few Christians would explicitly endorse this attitude, most of us have unknowingly adopted some of its features. For instance, That belief in God should always be comforting, never challenging or uncomfortable. That what matters is what some verse of the Bible means to me or how it makes me feel. That God wants his people to be healthy, prosperous, and powerful. That God will never give you more than you can handle, and that means that the thing you most fear could never happen to you. The central message of feel-good faith comes down to this injunction. Don't think very hard about what you believe. Just focus on what that belief does for you. The result is a flimsy faith, a faith with very little substance at all. When Christian faith is reduced to feelings of comfort, it's only a matter of time before it is abandoned. When it stops providing comfort, or when a new source of comfort is found, or when the believer is told that real maturity requires that you not need any comfort objects at all. This attitude towards faith is well captured in an analogy penned by Sam Harris. In a funny twist, Harris uses this analogy to defend religious believers from a certain kind of scorn. Writing to his atheistic peers, he asks, "Why are these religious folks so incapable of being persuaded by our clear, rational arguments for atheism? Are they really that foolish? Well, maybe not. Maybe we too have beliefs that we would rather hold on to, even in the face of clear evidence to the contrary." Harris begins by noting that just about everybody loves a nice fireplace. There's nothing quite so cozy and comforting as a warm, fragrant, wood-burning fire. But here's where the trouble begins. Harris writes, "The unhappy truth about burning wood has been scientifically established to a moral certainty. That nice, cozy fire in your fireplace is bad for you. It's bad for your children. It is bad for your neighbors and their children." When confronted with the environmental problem of wood fires, Harris has found that his friends, typically rational, typically environmentally concerned, resort to denial, justification, and bad arguments. Yes, this is delusional. Yes, it is irrational. Harris is clear that this is something we should all work to overcome. But in this one small way, he also asks the atheist to be a little more gracious to the delusional Christian. After all, he notes, we all prioritize comfort. We all have our happy delusions. Church, we have got to do better. We cannot content ourselves with a comforting delusion. And we can do better. Christian doctrine, like all claims about reality, should be judged by what it says, not whether it works as a source of comfort. To that end, Christian believers should work to know what they believe. We need to become a people who are unafraid to think about what we believe and why we believe it. We need to become a church of Christian philosophers. Now for some good news. The challenges raised by the so-called new atheists are not, in fact, new challenges at all. They are among the oldest of topics of philosophical discourse. Neither are they better than their historical precedents. Don't take my word for this. Michael Ruse is a professional philosopher and an atheist, and he writes, "Unlike the new atheists, I take scholarship seriously. I have written that the God delusion made me ashamed to be an atheist, and I meant it. Trying to understand how God could need no cause, Christians claim that God exists necessarily. I have taken the effort to try to understand what that means. Dawkins and company are ignorant of such claims, positively contemptuous of those who even try to understand them, let alone believe them. Thus, like a first-year undergraduate, he can happily go around asking loudly, 'What caused God?' as though he had made some momentous philosophical discovery. There are a lot of very bright and well-informed Christian theologians. We atheists should demand no less." New atheism is bad philosophy. But here's the crucial thing. It takes philosophical training to see the distinction between good and bad philosophy. The person who knows nothing about football is not going to see the difference between a well-executed play and a terrible defense. The person who has no background in music may not hear the difference between compelling dissonance and just plain noise. The person with no philosophical training in just this way can very easily mistake clever but empty arguments for persuasive reasoning. For this reason alone, the church needs more philosophically trained believers. When we proactively pursue philosophical study, we equip ourselves not only for the needs of others, but for the challenges that we will almost certainly encounter. Consider just a few of the big questions raised in philosophical discourse. How can a good God exist when there is so much evil in the world? How can we reconcile human free will with the sovereignty of God? If God is all-knowing and all-powerful, then why should we pray for anything or anyone? How ought we to understand unanswered prayer? It's easy to imagine that we have answers to these questions when these answers have not yet been tested. Now suppose that our answers are not only untested, they're largely unconsidered. That is, suppose we choose instead to ignore the hard questions for as long as possible. The outlook is not good. Flimsy faith is easily shaken. Life being what it is, we will face challenges of this sort. Philosophical reasoning helps us to prepare for these challenges by actively seeking and securing good reasons for our most fundamental beliefs. By engaging in the critical examination of our fundamental beliefs before they are challenged, we're better able to evaluate those beliefs calmly and rationally. It takes time and careful thought to secure a foundation, whether the foundation be conceptual or physical. It is always better to do so before the foundation is under threat of collapse. I hope that I have persuaded you of the value of philosophy for the Christian church. I want to end with this. There are at least two ways of understanding the charges that Sam Harris and the rest of the new atheists have raised against the Christian faith. First, that it must always be irrational. And second, that it is often irrationally held. In other words, the new atheists claim that there are no good reasons to believe in Christianity and plenty of good reasons to reject it. There are good, well thought out, carefully defended responses to this charge, many of which you will encounter in this course. But they also claim something else, that Christian believers don't actually hold their beliefs on the basis of good reasons. Instead, like the campfire-loving friends who refuse to acknowledge the troubling facts about wood fires, Christians put too great a value on how they feel, too little value on evidence and reason. This second charge is, I think, sometimes true. In fairness, I think it's equally true for many atheists. Despite what the new atheists suggest, atheism is at least as likely to be a source of comfort as theism. The person who wishes to live as she pleases will take far more comfort in the belief that there is no ultimate judge, no creator to whom she will be called to account, than she would take in Christian theism. Others may seek comfort in atheism after a period of pronounced suffering. It can be emotionally easier to believe that there is no God than to work to understand why God would allow you to face profound suffering. Similarly, some Christians follow Christ largely because their parents did. Some atheists reject God for precisely the same reason. People, Christian or otherwise, do not always hold their religious or a-religious beliefs on the basis of good reasons. The good news is the tools and resources of Christian philosophy are just exactly what the Christian needs in order to respond to both of these charges. There are good reasons to believe in the reality and goodness of God. There are substantive, powerful answers to the hard questions. There are better foundations for faith than good feelings, and philosophy is all about finding secure foundations for beliefs. In short, Christian philosophy can provide a powerful, fitting, appropriate response to both of the accusations levied by the new atheists. I will close with the words of C.S. Lewis. When writing Mere Christianity, Lewis says he was warned that the ordinary reader doesn't want theology. Give him plain, practical religion. Here's Lewis's response. In the old days, when there was less education and discussion, perhaps it was possible to get on with a few very simple ideas about God, but it is not so now. Everyone reads. Everyone hears things discussed. Consequently, if you do not listen to theology, that will not mean that you have no ideas about God. It will mean that you have a lot of wrong ones, bad, muddled, out-of-date ideas. So it is today with philosophy. The church needs good philosophy, for bad philosophy is everywhere.